Good morning, everybody. I am so excited to be with you all on this glorious Lord's Day, which is also Earth Day. Can we just clap it up for Earth Day? Earth Day. And we are excited because of a number of reasons. One, we get an opportunity to really lean in with our faith, with our intellect, with our various brands of genius around an issue that is not just important, but one that is of grave concern, especially when it comes to the African American community and the impacts of climate change and so much else. So I'm really grateful for that. But I'm also thankful to be here at Ebenezer, the Ebenezer Baptist Church. I'm so excited to be here. And I'm excited to be here, as Reverend Vaughn shared just a moment ago. I like being in the beginning of stuff. There's some folks who want to be there after you've done all the work and cut the ribbons and made it through. And okay, a little golf clap for them. But what I really love is when people show up in the beginning, show up in the basement, and build and grow together. And that's exactly what I feel in this moment. That when I look around this room and I look at this dynamic panel, I see people who have gathered in the beginning of something. And I want you to fast forward in your minds just a little bit, 5, 10, 15 years. Go forward and then imagine what you will feel like when you push the rewind button of your mind and the fruit of some dynamic food justice work is happening here. You will be one of the ones who will say, I was there. At the beginning, when the seed was planted, I was in the room. So give yourselves a hand for being there in the beginning. Finally, I'm grateful. Ebenezer Baptist Church members feel like cousins to me. I know we just met, but y'all feel real familiar to me. And I just want to thank you for your hospitality and your warmth, the dynamic staff of this church that has been working with us as well. It's been amazing to be here. I'm gonna get on out the way now, y'all, because there's some goodness that's about to happen on this panel with these dynamic folks who have gathered here. We wanted to have a discussion that's entitled Bigger Than the Next Meal. Because for so many of our churches and community organizations, there's a lot of focus on providing direct service, food, charity for people in need, and that's wonderful. But have you ever noticed how some folks who receive support, and I've been in some of those lines in my life, I'm not ashamed to say, I've been in some of those places where I've needed support, but I never wanted to stay there. And the current system that we have has a hole in the bucket that keeps people in an unhealthy pattern and cycle in so many ways. And this panel is going to bring the kind of information from their various lanes and brands of genius to help us not only plug the hole, but point us to a better way altogether. And so as you listen, we're going to learn together, but also be thinking about, where is my entry point to this work? Raise your hand if you played and did double dutch growing up. Where my double dutchers at? You know, with double dutch, you don't just jump into the rope all willy-nilly. You stand there and go like this. And you got to wait for that right moment. Reverend Vaughn talks about timing a lot. I love it. You got to wait for the right time and the right opportunity to jump in. And then once you get in, you better move those feet. You better move them. I want you to be not just idle observers, but I want you to feel like this. And I want you to listen when the farmer says something. If that's your cue, go ahead and jump in. When the doctor says something, when the food justice folks say something, I want you to be looking and listening for, where's my entry point that I can help to start or expand in my sphere of influence? I asked my dear brother, who's the president of ITC, to come to moderate this discussion. I truly believe, and I've called him this privately, publicly, it don't matter, I believe it in my heart. This man is like the Howard Thurman of our generation. And I honor him in the spirit and the gifting that's on him. And I knew he was the perfect person for so many reasons to help to hold this kind of conversation with this brand of genius here. And so if you would you clap for my brother as I turn it over to him, Reverend Matthew Williams, president of ITC.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. It is, I've heard you say that a million times, and I'm like, nope. There is only one Howard Washington Thurman. Amen. But thank you for that warm and kind introduction. And thank you, I want to thank you for your leadership. And amen. You may remember an introduction I gave of you a few years back at a gathering of the Forum for Theological Exploration, in which I talked about the lineage in which Dr. Brown sits, not just in his blood lineage, but the lineage of the Ella Bakers and the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Vernon Johns. And you are the Vernon Johns of our generation. Amen. Really tying critical connections between our faith and food and the systems and our participation in the work of Jesus and justice. And so I thank God for you and for your leadership. Amen. And grateful again to be here at the epicenter of Black church and Black justice, the Ebenezer Baptist Church. I'm especially grateful to be here just to hold space for this conversation that's about to happen. Look, we were in the back and we were already getting started, y'all. Wish we would have had a mic and a recording device to share with you all what was already underway. But this is going to be a flowing conversation around this issue of it is bigger than our next meal. As Dr. Brown said, churches are frontline first responders in the issues of food insecurity, right? And most times that first response has to do with making sure that we feed people, right? And that comes out of our faith. Jesus said, if you love me, what? Feed my sheep. But we have recently experienced a moment in COVID-19. I call COVID-19 an apocalypse, right? Not as in the Walking Dead sense, right? But in the sense of when the book of Revelation is actually the apocalypse of John, the uncovering, the revealing of the world that is. And what COVID revealed to us is that charity is not enough. That's right. We can't focus just on symptoms. We've got to look also at systems, right? And so this is an invitation, as Dr. Brown would say, for us to go upstream, right? To look at the sources that have created the symptoms that we're dealing with. And so again, on that note, I am ecstatic to be able to hold space for this conversation to emerge among this panel. And so before we get further into the what, I want to invite the who to show up and to announce yourself into the space. And so I want to start with Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith. And I want to invite you just to say who you are, say a little bit about your work, and how you approach this conversation.
First, I just want to thank you so much for the invitation. Bread for the World is here. I'm representing Bread for the World. Dr. Vaughn, Dr. Williams, Dr. Brown, shout out to all of you. Thank you so much. I am the Senior Associate for Pan-African and Orthodox Faith Engagement at Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. And we do public policy on Capitol Hill and with the President's Office and government agencies around the things we're talking about today. I also had the profound honor of recently being elected as the president, one of the presidents of the World Council of Churches, the one from North America. I'm the first woman from the historic Black churches to be elected in this profound role. So I'm wearing two hats today, but especially for Bread for the World in this space. Both care about this issue, and it's Pan-African for us. It's not just U.S., it's Pan-African, it's global. All of the diaspora and Africa matters in this conversation. And I'm hoping that I can be true to that in some of my remarks today. And I come from the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, just to say in terms of my church home. Thank you so much. God bless.
Good morning. Thank you for having me as well. My name is Cicely Garrett. I'm the co-executive director of National Black Food and Justice Alliance. We are a coalition of Black-led organizations from across the country working towards cultivating and advancing not only leadership, but amplifying Black narratives, building self-determination, and organizing for food sovereignty and land justice. So I look forward to speaking with you today. Thank you.
Peace and greetings, everyone. Thank you all for having me here on the panel. My name is Christopher Lemons. I'm a farmer here in Atlanta. I run a small farm called Gratitude Botanical Farm on the west side of the city of Atlanta. And I'm also the director for programs and outreach at a local nonprofit here that supports community gardens and farms called Food Well Alliance. Part of our goals are to advance the education and the acumen of farms as businesses and being able to support community gardens in the production of healthy crops and making sure that people know more about where their food comes from and how to connect with it. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and glad to see you all here, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Dr. Karen Goodlett. I'm a practicing internist at Kaiser Permanente in Atlanta, Georgia. And I've been in Atlanta since 1991, and for years I've treated, internists, we call ourselves doctors for adults, so 17 and over. But most of the people that come in to see us are sick. They're not the younger ones. Older people, middle age on up. And so in internal medicine, as many fields of medicine, we're trained to treat disease. And treatment means drugs and surgeries and procedures. And that's what we do, and we do it to the best of our ability. And I think that's great, but it's not enough. So at some point, the medical field, we've gradually begun to realize that this is not sustainable. They say that the disease in our country is going to bankrupt this nation. And rates of obesity are soaring, diabetes is soaring. The number one killer in the nation, sometimes I ask people that and they said, guns? But it's heart attacks, it's heart disease. So there is a group in medicine now called, an organization called the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and you can become board certified in lifestyle medicine. So I'm board certified in internal medicine and now in lifestyle medicine. So our goal is prevention. And it's not a new notion. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, but we kind of ignore that. But it's time to pay attention to it. So we want to prevent disease. We want to reverse disease. We want to promote health. And that's my new passion in medicine. Instead of spending the rest of my career handing out prescriptions, I want to hand out ideas to eat healthy foods.
Good morning. My name is Reginald Mason. I'm a pulmonary and critical care specialist at Kaiser Permanente. The lady to my right, about 30 years ago, had a moment of visual impairment and said yes to my proposal of marriage. So that's mostly why I'm here. I'm glad to see this wonderful group assembled here. I see there's a lot of wisdom in the group. I see Ethel Richards, who is a food guru and thought leader in the area of food. I see a young person over there, the young man with the gray hoodie. I'm so glad that you're here listening to this dialogue. And so the main reason I'm here is because during COVID and throughout my career, I've worked in the intensive care unit. And I've seen individuals come to the intensive care unit who have literally been on a suitcase full of drugs. They come with a suitcase full of drugs that haven't worked. And so while I'm not suggesting that anyone stop their medications, I am suggesting that the food that we eat serves as the basis for our health. And we can see the patterns of consumption, production and consumption have resulted in much of the disease that we see in our society today. So I'm here to talk about that. Thank you.
Greetings, good morning, everyone. Let me start by saying I'm so honored. I never would have imagined that I would be standing and talking on such a historical platform, followed by such a dynamic panel of people. My name is Dean Parker. I'm a 100% certified naturally grown farmer. My family and I have at least I think about eight farms around the state of Georgia now, for a culmination of about 340 acres. Faith in farming is one of my biggest things about life. Martin Luther King, if you followed him to any degree, actually I read on a panel over here in the museum one time that since age 18, every summer he would go on the farm. Hopefully I'll get a chance to talk more about that later on in the panel, but it feels good to be a part of that dream, and I pray that's further fulfilled today. Thank you.
You ready? So we have, again, a dynamic panel, and I would be remiss as I was sitting here listening to not acknowledge the ancestors who are among us. This is a conversation our ancestors want us to be in. This is work that they want us to be in, and they are with us in it. And so we give honor to the ancestors that we have named and those who we have not named in this place. I enter this conversation not just as president of the Interdenominational Theological Center, where we cultivate as our educational aim what we call prophetic problem solvers. Shout out to Dr. Joy Orr. But also, I enter this conversation as a cancer survivor, 9 years. And for me, food was a critical portal into transformation. The transformation of my relationship to food and understanding the relationship of what was on my plate to these larger systems that we're participating in was a critical part of my healing journey through cancer. And so this conversation will take kind of a dynamic look at the relationship between our personal practices and the larger systems that shape them. And so to start this conversation, let's establish some basic terms, right? Some definitions, so we all know what we're talking about, right? And I'm just gonna throw them out and allow you to pick them up. And I'll ask Cecily to start. But terms like, you hear all the time, food desert, right? Food apartheid, food sovereignty, food insecurity, stuff like health and healing, what those things really mean. I want to invite you to just talk about let's establish some definitions around those basic terms.
Yeah, so language matters, and how you define or regard something also colors your response to it. So, in our work, I don't actually use the term food desert, and haven't for quite some time. Partially because a desert is a naturally occurring thing in nature, and a food desert is 100% not a naturally occurring thing. It is very intentional and very destructive in nature of how they came to be. And so by calling it a desert, it sort of softens people's thoughts about it, and I don't think that we should have any misconceptions about how a food desert came to be. I also never liked the term even before then because it does not acknowledge the work of people who are there. Like, I haven't been to any community here, overseas, wherever, where there aren't people actively working to improve the life of people within their own community. And while they may not have all of the resources and things that they need, to say it's a desert is the absence of, and that's not true at all. It's not a true depiction of what is going on. And so I think a more accurate term for that would be more like food apartheid. And so that's a very systemic destruction of Black self-determination and our own agency over our food systems. And not only is it destruction of it, it's also then flooding our markets with marketing and destructive type foods and fast food chains. And so that's very intentional in nature and is not something that is naturally occurring without quite amount of support and power behind that. And so it's a better thought process around the structural inequities that you'll see within the food systems, especially as they show up in our communities. And so I think shifting that also better gets people to think in the mindset, and it also elevates what you will get, because when you say food deserts, then the solutions you get are food pantries or food banks or a new grocery store. And there's not that there's anything not wrong with that, but if you really wanted to elevate and get all the way back to our growers and like food in the ground, then you have to go beyond that and be looking to like, what does Black food sovereignty looks like? And that means that we have control over all our food systems from how it comes through the ground to consumption. And so bringing people into a different conversation and a different thought process about what is our own agency and how can we all get free in this, I think is important when we talk about language.
And so for me in Atlanta, the terminology food desert is something that we kind of take as a pejorative. Because if you kind of think about it, and we're in church, so you can reference biblical stories where sustenance has been found in the desert. Just to Cicely's point, there are people that are literally doing the work to overcome some of the things where it's actually been decisions being made as to who gets to eat what, and when. For me personally, my father growing up was a store manager at Kroger here in Atlanta. So one thing I always remember him telling me as a child growing up is that groceries were distributed by zip code. So when we talk about food apartheid, they're literally making a decision as to what type of vegetables, at what quality, at what level of expiration that they're being actually distributed in the grocery stores. And if you want to see that, you can drive around to some of the grocery stores here in Atlanta and they're on the same road, on the same street, but they're above and below I-20, and you can see the quality and the level of the freshness that you have access to versus if you go above I-20. Even some of the more high dollar chains, those are set up above I-20 as opposed to below. So those are some of the things that, I think about when we talk about terminology and how it's used.
Thank you, Chris.
I'm inclined to share a quick story in response to Chris's observation. My sister lives in Los Angeles, and she has diabetes. So she goes to the McDonald's sometimes in her neighborhood, as I have in the past as well. And she likes the iced coffee there. And sometimes she goes outside of her neighborhood, she lives in a black neighborhood, elsewhere to other parts of Los Angeles, to the more affluent areas. And she doesn't like the iced coffee at McDonald's there. And I asked her, well, why is that? So she asked someone at the McDonald's in her neighborhood, why is the iced coffee better in this neighborhood, in the black neighborhood? She said, oh, they put more sugar in the iced coffee in her neighborhood as opposed to elsewhere in Los Angeles. I had to share that little story. I thought it was interesting.
So, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to really support the conversations thus far, because I think what it's pointing to are systems. When we talk about food, we have to talk about systems, not just what you see on the plate. What's on the plate? How did it get there? Who made a decision about what you're eating? Who grew the food? Who envisioned the food? Who prepared the food? Those are the questions we need to be asking when we talk about food justice, is where is this food coming from, and why and how did it land on my plate? And that's a food system, and that system is global. It is not just in the domestic context. We get things like bananas and other fruits and vegetables that come outside of the United States. And that's all about food systems. And so whatever language that we use to point to the systems is critically important to the work that we do. So when you look at public policy, which is what we do at Bread for the World, we're looking at the policies and practices that determine where food goes or doesn't go, right? So that's going to be important to how we think about what's on your plate. And what voice do you have to ensure that the food on your plate is representative of you? That it's not food, but it's nutritious food, right? Where is that nutritious food coming from? And absolutely, black farmers are key to unlocking that door, because black farmers are you, all of you. You can grow in your apartment. You can grow in your urban community, develop a co-op. You are in a position to determine what's on your plate. And it's not just going to Kroger or some other place. We want to talk about sustainable life. Sustainable life means you take agency over what it is that you are eating, because it will have everything to do with the kinds of diseases that my sister has just said. In the end, it's in your interest to exercise leadership. I'll leave it at that point.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So food sovereignty seems to suggest an alternative system, right? So talk a little bit about how you understand food sovereignty and the systems that support it.
Gladly, thank you. I think one of the things that's gravely overlooked, I want to bring up Tulsa, Black Wall Street. You know, we're very familiar with our people owning a lot of their own, but the conversation of who the grocery store bought his milk from is never had. Who he bought his leather from is never had. There were black farms surrounding Tulsa, and being able to buy resources that you grow yourself from your own, that's systemic. You know, when you look around for, let's just stick with small commercial farmers. What I mean by small is 100 acres or less. Few and far between. You know, there's an abundance of us when it comes to the urban setting. But there needs to be a push to take those like myself, this brother here, who are qualified, and force them into I don't want to call it a slavery, but we love what we do, but you know, it's in our hands the responsibility to produce more. We understand that these systems are in place, and sitting around talking about them hasn't gotten us anywhere. We have to start the action. Now, I will say this, and I'll be done. Food sovereignty for me has created a bit of a challenge. Because my family, we have our own chickens, cows, sheep, goats, food, all the above, the quality is way up here. Now, when I leave those areas, I'm kind of starving a little bit because I refuse to settle. You know, so I got to package food and take it with me and ration that food, because the diseases and the quality of food that's out there, I know systemically it's there to cause damage. So, you know, we all have a bigger responsibility. For those of you who are parents or influencers in some kind of way, it's time out for the sports. Farming is a sport too. You work all the same muscles, maybe more. I found myself stronger than some athletes in some areas.
So it occurs to me as we're talking that one critical element of food sovereignty is bodily sovereignty, right? In terms of really self-determining how we eat, the practices that we undertake. So in terms of health and healing, I want to invite the physicians on the panel to talk about what's the bodily and the practical element of this food sovereignty question.
And I think that's a great question, and it's kind of complex and sometimes controversial, because on one hand I hear, you know, diseases in the Black community. It's because of our neighborhoods, lack of food access, you know, lack of finances, and all those things are true. But I still can't, you know, maybe as a physician who's treating people, I still wonder, what is our individual role? So sometimes you don't, you know, people don't always have a lot of money, but most of the people I see, they're not wealthy, but they have enough money to have cell phones and, I don't know, video games and make it to here and there and go to restaurants and go to Red Lobster. And I think there's also mainly a lack of knowledge. You know, there are certainly some people who are just so poor that they have to have handouts all the time, but there's a large group of us that can make healthy choices. And I think that's the majority. And sometimes I go to medical meetings and I see physicians, white and black and all colors, who are not healthy appearing. And it breaks my heart when I see a significant number of my African American sisters who are the largest in the room. And we can't blame that on lack of finances. So there is something else missing in terms of what we're doing to help promote our own health and the choices that we make. So, and I don't know the answer. Is it knowledge? Is it just a strong cultural influence? are there stresses? I read an article yesterday. A white psychologist decades ago had written about the disparities of the black community. And she says it was the stress of being black. And she was a white woman. Stress of being black is what led to our diseases. And she was poo-pooed and run out the room, 30 years ago. But now that's coming to the forefront. So are we not really in touch with the stress of being a deprived or depressed group? So I think it's a complex issue with a lot of factors that we need to uncover and explore. And as a physician sitting in the office with a patient, I don't have immediate problems. I can't immediately solve sociological problems. If somebody's really, really having a hard time financially, I refer them to the social worker. But I still believe that when we can make a choice, we need to be educated as to what's the best choice and why. So that means instead of buying bags of chips, we might buy more apples. And sometimes those to me seem very simple, but I think they're choices that a lot of us can make. More broccoli, more whole grains, less cheeseburgers. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Chris, you want to say something?
it's complex.
I just wanted to kind of touch and build on what you were saying, is that a lot of time for us as black people, African Americans, we have suffered a lot with generational trauma and emotional trauma, and the way that we interact and cope with that, through eating or certain habits. Those are things that, we have to look at as well in our community. And then even sometimes conditioning disease or illness in our families through eating. A lot of times we say it's soul food, or, what we might eat at a repast is what kind of led to that person, passing away anyway. And it's certain things like that we have to take a look at how we reform those habits. It's not to criticize and judge people, but it's to lovingly lift them into alternative solutions around how we do things to solve problems in our community.
Yeah, and so I think our connection to and access to land is essential to our own healing power and eventual liberation. And so we can't get past all of what this is, and some of us sometimes have to return essentially to the scene of the crime. So I do think that there is an importance about centering culture in the way that we eat. I do think that there is a sense of agency and the power of that. But I also think that everyone should have the same power of choice regardless of their zip code. And quite frankly, now we don't. So even if it is an impetus for us to have people make better choices, it's hard to make better choices that aren't even available to you. So when I look at the end caps of the grocery stores over by me versus the end caps if I just go 3 miles up the street and cross over I-20, it's a much, much different world. And so I think people of all income levels make poor choices. And somehow we have a greater burden of people who have less resources to do that. So whether you make $17,000 or $70,000 or $170,000, but it's just making a poor choices has a greater detriment to you when you have less resources. And so I think it is a yes and approach. So yes, do people need to also make better choices, but you also need to be building in places for people to have access to have better choices of things. And not even access, because access assumes that someone else needs to be involved, but for you to have their own free agency around what it is that you eat and knowing why that is that way. And even having, like you said, the quality. Some people are not even sure to know like what the vast difference is between the eggs that come from his farm versus the ones you get to store. Like they out of this world. Like, you know, we opened an agroecology center with FAMU, and the director there is also a professor, like has his own, and he was like, I have all these eggs, and I was like, I'll figure out how to get these on the plane. Like me and the other director walked back on the plane with like 48 eggs deep, and they were like, oh, I'm not checking these.
That's right.
I'm bringing them in because these are like gold to go home with me. But you have to have some of both in that, I think, for this to be effective.
I wanted to pick up on this theme around land and also about philosophical approaches to eating. The first one is about land. Land is not only life-giving for food, but is also a basic tenet to build wealth. I want to say that one more time. Land helps to determine if you have wealth. Land also determines if you have your own power. This is a really important point. And some of us lack power and we lack wealth in part because we haven't gotten serious about land. So, especially for those of us who are descendants of former landowners or who have that, we all have that history of the enslavement period. But guess what? We can go back, we can get that back. We can get that back, and we can get that back in our urban dwellers. But just remember, land is equated with good, not only nutritious food, but wealth and power, your own base for that. That's one piece. The second piece I wanted to mention is what Dr. Brown is doing, which is like such a huge yay for me. And that is saying Black churches have land. One more time, we're in Ebenezer Baptist Church. Look around, right? Ebenezer has land. That means you have some power. And guess what? The Black church is what? Goes all the way back to when? 1700s at least. Not 1800s, 1700s. And much of the land of Black churches was donated to some extent by Black farmers. There's a direct tie-in around the legacy of land, Black church, and farming. Some of our Black churches would not even exist if it wasn't for Black farmers. And those are our ancestors. Dr. Brown is helping us reclaim our own legacy. Don't let them tell you this is something new. Don't let them give you that narrative. This is our story. Some of you know Blessed Assurance, right? This is our story, and we're sticking with it. We are reclaiming what Dr. Williams is saying are the ancestors, who I agree with him are rejoicing that we're finally having this moment at this day and time. And we're here at the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is perfect because it is that kind of antithesis of the point that I'm making here. But just my final point is, Black churches need to help us reimagine our philosophy of food. We used to do a better job in those older days, actually, because Black farmers were so close to us. At the beginning of the last century, we owned 19 to 20% of the farmlands. You know how much we own now? Less than 1%. We've lost ground. Yes, we did the Great Migration. Yes, we did. Yes, we did all of that. We wanted better opportunities. I totally get it. You wanted to get out of terror. My parents wanted to get out of terror. I'm not mad at you. I totally get it. But this is another moment. Yeah. And we need to fight for what belongs to us. And my last point about that is the government has a role to play in all that. Because unfortunately, government has not been as faithful to our legacy. And so, how many of you just did this April 15th thing? I mean, I'm just asking a question. How many of you just did the April 15th thing? You know what it is, paying taxes. Guess what? What did you do? You just paid for your own investment in your own community. And we have to be real serious about that. That is not charity. You pay on the 15th of April. That's your money. You are a shareholder. You are a stockholder in this country. And if you don't own that, you've missed your blessing, and you are definitely dismissing what the ancestors would want for us. So when you vote, when you pay your taxes, own up to being a stockholder in this part of the world and globally. So I'll stop there, but just to say it all ties together. We need to reinvest the money we've already paid into our communities and make sure the land and all the rest is representative of what is good for us.
So prophetic, those words. And so my thoughts are around the idea of nothing tastes better than healthy fields. Nothing tastes better than healthy fields. And as a community, we often are hijacked by our natural affinity for salt, fat, and sugar. Let's think about it. If you were a caveman in the desert, caveman in the forest, trying to survive the winter, and you saw some kale on one side and some Kentucky Fried Chicken on another, which is going to give you more calories to make it through the famine? Of course, it's going to be the fried chicken, right? But there is no more famine. Famines are gone. There are calories everywhere. They're very low value calories, but there are calories everywhere. And it translates, I believe, into our epidemic of cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, and cancer. And so let's think about one concept. There's something that you can do to help prevent death from colon cancer. It's a medical procedure. Has anyone ever heard, or has anyone ever thought about what procedure that is? Colonoscopy. Okay. So let's think about the dynamic of your going home and having a meal, maybe of bacon and eggs for lunch, for breakfast, maybe a steak for dinner, and then you cower in fear. Bacon, a steak, those are class 1 carcinogens. They actually lead to colon cancer. The World Health Organization has clearly stated this. It's not controversial. Mm-hmm. Bacon is a class 1 carcinogen. It causes colon cancer. So what do? We eat the bacon, and then we cower in fear about getting colon cancer, and we go to the doctor and pay our $250 copay so we can get our colonoscopy. Does that sound like maybe a little bit of insanity? Just a little? We have to think, and I'm going to challenge this panel. You can go to Walmart and get some kale and some spinach and some strawberries and some tofu and be
Brown rice.
regions healthier than going to that end cap and getting that highly processed and carcinogenic food. So we have to think about the choices that we made. Dr. Gullett pointed it out. We have to start thinking about those choices and thinking about the marketing people making hundreds of thousands of dollars per year to learn how to hijack us, to buy those Hostess cupcakes. That's destruction in a package. Let's not partake. That can be step one. It can start an hour from now.
Dr. Mason, as you were talking, I thought about something someone said to me one time, which is, don't judge my choices if you don't know my options.
Yes.
Right? And I'm thinking about Cecily, our neighborhood where ITC is situated, where Walmart just across the street from ITC and just across the street from the Atlanta University Center just closed. That was the only grocery store in that zip code. Wow. So now what are our options on the corner of Martin Luther King? I mean, this is interesting. The corner of the streets named after Martin Luther King and Joseph Lowry. Wow. It's a gas station. It's a Zaxby's. It's a Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's a Chick-fil-A. That's what we have at the nexus of MLK and Joseph Lowry. Right? So there's a deep relationship between how we think about ourselves and think about our bodies and the lived environments that we inhabit, right? So I'll say this, and I want to offer this back up to the panel for some conversation. As I think about my own journey, right? Yes, food and movement to a whole food, plant-based diet was critical for me, but food was not the first step. When I faced that cancer diagnosis, the first step for me was clarifying whether my life was worth saving. And that grounding in worthiness was the basis that made everything else possible. But to ground in that worthiness, I had to detox a whole bunch of theological, sociological, and otherwise understandings that I didn't know I had still had in me, right? In order to be able to move in a way that actually not just saved my life, but allowed me to thrive and flourish. So how do we, and it's so important that we recognize that, and this is what I love about what Dr. Brown does with the Black Church Food Security Network. This is not just a collection of land and properties. This is a spiritual nexus that gets at the basis of who we are and how God is calling us to be and work in the world. So how do we begin to shift? Again, this goes to systems, right? Systems actually are not just what's put together, it's the underlying ideas around what gives rise to that system. So how do we begin to shift from the nexus of these kinds of spaces, the way we think about ourselves, and then how that shapes our relationship to food and to land and to these other systems?
If I may, now, I do policy work, but I'm a theologian and a pastor first. And one of the key ingredients, I think, to that is what we do in Sunday school. I really think it's as basic as Sunday school. I think it's as basic as the sermon that is preached on Sunday mornings. I think it's Bible study. I think it's prayer meeting. I think it's all those things. How we frame our rhetoric. I'm not reducing the holy word to rhetoric, but I'm trying to get to a generic concept of how we speak and how we think and how we philosophize around our framing of life. Goes back to the question you said you had to ask when you were facing cancer. All of us are facing death at some extent. What is our worthiness? Okay, I admit, I'm Christian and I work in multi-faith environments, but whatever your faith expression is, there is something about a universal truth that says you matter. You were created for a purpose. You were put on the planet for a plan. What is that plan? And I think faith, however we interpret our faith, there are literally, just coming from a Christian perspective, there are scriptures after scriptures after scriptures about, look, the Bible is about the land. Okay? The Bible is about moments of famine and moments of plenty and moments of desperation. You can't leave a book in the Bible pretty much without the dance around nutrition and land and worthiness. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It starts at verse 1. We need to reframe, reimagine, even what the holy texts are, regardless of your faith tradition. How can you reframe your narrative around what the ancestors have already taught us and already bring to us in the sacred text? And if that's not okay for you, what about your grandmother? Or what about your granddaddy? Or have you done the investigation on who you are? Who do you belong to generations before you got here? How did they get by when they had little to nothing materially, but had everything spiritually? Call their name. Find out their stories. And let it live in you. They're waiting for you to tap who they are. So I would say that's where it starts, as people of faith and as people particularly of African descent. And claim Africa, by the way, while you're in it.
Amen.
Because we do not start on the transatlantic. Hello.
Right. Correct.
Hello. Yes. May 25th is Africa Day. Just saying.
Let me invite Dean's voice in here, brother. Come on.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to talk to two things in particular. You mentioned detox.
Yeah.
I want to mention it naturally and spiritually if I can. Naturally, I want to say everybody learn your blood type and try to curve your diets to that. It's going to be very helpful. I'm in my 3rd year of that. It has helped with allergies and so many other things. Secondly, the good doctor here was talking about changing the narrative of our doctrine, per se, if I can use that word. A gentleman to my right was all talking about the effects that pork has on us. All right, so let me try to bring this together. There's chapters through the Word of God that dictates what our dietary intake should be, okay? Further down the line, Christ was crucified. My question is, how does a man dying make pork clean? Because that's kind of the doctrine that people say, well, I'll just pray over my pork and I'll eat it still. But the holy instructions was don't. Yeah.
Good
So
food,
now,
good
so
meat,
now,
good God, let's eat.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. So now there's a passage in the book of Timothy that tells us to receive our food with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God and prayer. That small portion sanctified by the word of God is overlooked. Everybody's jumped straight over to the prayer part. How do you know what's sanctified? You go back to his word and you see what's good and what's not good to be eaten. I'll end with this. The very first time in the Bible it says, be ye holy, is in that chapter about what we're eating. The second time the Bible says, be ye holy, it's about what you're eating.
Thank you, brother. Chris, assessment.
So for me, you initially talked about the Walmart on Martin Luther King closing down. So for me, every day I drive up Lowry to work. And the things that I see, historic neighborhoods my family has used to live in. You also talk about the intellectual bastion of Black America.
That's it.
So you got Morehouse, you got Spelman, you got Clark Atlanta, you got Morris Brown. What has happened in our community that we have intellectually divested from our communities? So you mean to tell me that in the midst of 4 historic Black colleges that we can't come together with all of the degrees, the income, and for people to actually solve our problems ourselves? That's the true sovereignty and autonomy and the power that we need to bring back into our communities. So for me, my family on my mom's side is definitely from Atlanta. On my dad's side, we're from Georgia, like going back to like 1840s. You know, I learned about farming from my grandfather on land that his grandfather purchased that we still hold to this day. So when we talk about, you know, actually making those investments in your family and actually putting your money where your mouth is to solve those problems, you know, the family at Atlanta Harvest, y'all are excellent examples of that here in Georgia and just for us as a nation, you know, as examples of men and women that have invested in their family, in their community to help grow things back out. But for me personally, just as somebody that's from here, when I just see the amount of intellectual and financial capital that we have here just in Atlanta alone and how it's not properly leveraged, it's kind of a disservice and it's somewhat disheartening, you know? And then just to take it back to what we were called to do out of the Bible, initially we were asked to be land stewards. That's it. That's it. Take care of this land and worship and honor me and God. That's it. That's what we were asked to do. And even when we got put out of Eden, you were still told you were going to be a land steward. But now it had been called out that every time you go into that ground, you're going to get less and less, less and less. The law of diminishing returns was already established. And then for us as farmers, when we talk about soil stewardship and replenishing and building out healthy soils, and you look at the amount of depletion from nutrients in soil, I think as an example, if you were living in maybe like 1920 versus today, you would have to eat 20 apples from the 1920 apples. Well, our nutritional load is higher going back into the 20s versus now. So in order for you to get those same nutritional loads, you have to eat a whole bunch of our apples and things that we have today versus just eating one. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, so you asked what we could do, and so I'm a proponent of therapy for everyone, because we need to do important work together, and we can't do that work together until we acknowledge the trauma that we have all incurred and continue to face, and then heal from that. Because if not, then it shows up and shows out. Discourse will take us off track about where we need to be and other stuff, and that's what they want, but it makes it harder for us to be together. And so I think that there is power in us coming together, like Chris said, but we also need to heal and acknowledge like what has happened to us before we get there. And I do think reconnecting with the land is there, but we also need to do some individual work before we can do work together. I also think to elevate it beyond what Chris talked about, like land stewardship. So this concept of individual land ownership has only come about since we've been here in white dominant world, and there's a lot of power attached to it. But that's not what this was ever invented to be. Even our indigenous people thought about being land stewards. This earth is for everyone. It's not meant for us to be owned or to leverage in power. And so if we can get back to us being stewards of the land as we think about this on Earth Day, and our job is to be keeping this. And you know, the younger generation is as brash as they are because they feel like we're not leaving them nothing. There's not going to be earth and stuff for him because we haven't been good land stewards. And with that, we can think of other creative ways for us to have land that is stewarded and not based on ownership. And so you have community land trust and other visions of how we can bring land back together and cooperatively work that I also think will be our solution. So right now, you know, I think we went through a period of trying to change or alter the system, which I don't think there's not value in that, but I also don't think those systems were ever created to work for us because they aren't built on the values and the culture and the things that we uplift. And so in order for us to fully get there and to reach a point of liberation, I think we have to have things that are rooted in what we are rooted in and not trying to play their game. We need to create what is our own and come from that if we are to ever truly be successful and I think to truly be liberated.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have a few minutes remaining before we turn to, was there one more comment?
Oh, I was touched by what you said about connecting with therapy, Ms. Garrett, and I agree. And we've been talking about systems. So I just wanted to say that when you eat a piece of celery, it has a lot of fiber in it. And when that fiber gets broken down in your gut, it feeds your gut bacteria. And this is an internal system I'm talking about. And those gut bacteria produce, with eating the fiber, produce something called short-chain fatty acids. We know that short-chain fatty acids in your gut, because of that piece of celery you ate, elevate your mood. And so as part